Seb adjusted his wristwatch as he glanced at the flight information on his phone. He had taken a week off to fly to Abuja, not just to honor yet another invitation from Mrs. Igala, but also to meet top health officials if he could arrange it. Mrs. Igala was no ordinary woman. She wielded significant influence not only within the ruling party but in the country's entire political sphere. People fondly called her Mama PAP, Mother of the People's Ambassadors Party. Seb had long believed that change wouldn't come to the country unless its people, young and old, took ownership of their civic duties. But in this country, most people left it to God. If something was wrong, they would say, God will judge them. That's why he was pleasantly surprised by an incident at Igovia Airport. Seb arrived at the airline counter only to be told the flight had been cancelled. His shoulders slumped in disappointment. Another wasted trip. He was about to leave when a family of 4, parents with 2 young children, approached the counter. What happened next caught his interest. The receptionist, a heavily made-up woman with false eyelashes and an air of disinterest, barely glanced at the tickets they handed her. With an irritated flick of her wrist, she tossed them back. Have you not heard? The flight has been cancelled, she said, then resumed chatting with her colleague. Seb watched as the husband's face darkened. The man had clearly had enough. His voice rose, echoing through the terminal. Who exactly do you think you are? We are your customers, and you should be courteous to us, he bellowed. Passengers turned to watch. The receptionist blinked in surprise. We should be upset that your airline cancelled our flight without notice. Instead of apologizing, you're angry that we dared show up at this counter? What kind of service is this? Do you know how much the owner of this airline borrowed to build this business and employ you? And you sit here, ruining it? Seb nodded to himself. This was rare. Here was an ordinary citizen demanding accountability, refusing to let incompetence slide. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the country after all. The commotion at the airline counter had drawn attention. A rotund, sweaty man with a visible damp patch on his shirt emerged from the back office. Clearly, the supervisor. He wiped his brow and assessed the scene. The angry man's tone carried an air of familiarity with the airline's chairman, which seemed to unsettle him. Oga, make you no vex. Come inside my office, make we talk, the supervisor said, forcing a grin. But the man wasn't done. He continued his verbal onslaught against the receptionist, refusing to let poor customer service slide. The supervisor tried again. Oga, I'm the supervisor. I go deal with any problem where you get. Are you sure? The man asked skeptically. I'm sure, Oga. Make you come inside. Finally, shaking his head but still resolute, the aggrieved man followed the supervisor into the office, his wife and children trailing behind. As the man and his family entered the office, something remarkable happened at the check-in counter. The same receptionist who had claimed the flight was cancelled suddenly resumed work, accepting tickets and checking passengers in. Seb watched, astounded. The flight wasn't cancelled at all, yet many frustrated passengers had already left, believing they had no choice. Moments later, his own ticket was processed. He was now a direct beneficiary of the man's bold confrontation. As passengers began boarding, Seb spotted the man who had exposed the deception. He hurried over, dragging his suitcase. "By all accounts, you won," Seb said, shaking the man's hand enthusiastically. The man chuckled. "I simply refuse to be taken for a fool." "If this country had more people like you," Seb said, "it would be a better place. Do you know that the moment you went into the office, the counter opened and they started checking in people?" The man smirked. "Don't mind them. The flight was never cancelled. The plane was sitting on the tarmac, waiting." Seb's eyes widened. "Really? Are you sure?" "Of course. Once we got into the office, the supervisor assured me we'd be on the flight to Abuja." Seb frowned. "But why lie in the first place?" The man sighed. "Can't you see? If they tell you the flight is cancelled, you leave in frustration. Then they resell your seat for extra cash, or some agent miraculously appears to offer you a last-minute seat on the same flight for a fee." Seb shook his head. "It's a racket. Obviously. And trust me, that supervisor is in on it. Those receptionists wouldn't pull a scam like this without approval from higher-ups. It's all part of a culture where everyone wants to build a 2-story house in their father's compound. Not through honest work, but through shady deals, even daylight robbery. They deliberately create problems so they can sell solutions at a price." Seb exhaled sharply. "Thanks to you, I've been able to get on this flight." As they parted ways, Seb settled into his seat, reflecting on what he had just witnessed. The experience only strengthened his resolve. He, too, would play his part in the country's future, no matter how small. Seb settled into the plush leather seat at the back of the black Jeep, its tinted windows shielding him from the world outside. The hum of the engine barely registered in his ears as his mind swirled with questions. What could this madam possibly want from me? He wondered. He felt oddly confident that he had nothing to offer Mrs. Igala. Since their first encounter at the Hotel Presidential in Igovia nearly 18 months ago, their interactions had been strictly over the phone. A voice that dripped with luxury, wealth, and powerful connections. As the Jeep rolled into the heart of the city, Seb took in the scenery. The roads were pristine, well marked with fresh white paint, and the traffic lights functioned like clockwork. Drivers obeyed them with discipline, an astonishing contrast to the chaotic, horn-blaring madness of Igovia's streets. It's as if the world here has been tranquilized, he thought. Many had said that driving through some parts of Abuja felt like being in the capital of a Western country. Now he understood why. The Jeep slowed as they approached a massive gate. A MOPO, mobile police officer, peered through a narrow gap, inspecting the occupants before giving a sharp salute and waving them in. The large compound opened up before Seb, the grandeur of the place almost overwhelming. They must have assumed I was another one of her VIP visitors, Seb mused. As the vehicle came to a stop, the door swung open before he could reach for the handle. From the lounge, Mrs. Igala rushed out, her elaborate gown swaying with every step. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around him. "Come in, doctor," she beamed. "Make yourself at home." Before he could respond, a small army of servants poured out, gracefully collecting his luggage and a few other items from the back of the vehicle. Seb took a slow, deep breath, stepping into the mansion's vast living room. One detail stood out immediately. There were no children in sight. The house was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of air conditioners. Maybe they're all abroad, attending some outrageously expensive boarding school, he thought. Seb had barely begun to take in his surroundings when the soft, rhythmic click of heels echoed down the marble staircase. He turned his head just in time to see a young woman descending gracefully. There was something about her that instantly set her apart. She wasn't a house help, he could tell that much immediately. Her posture, her elegant but understated dress, and the confidence in her stride spoke of someone accustomed to luxury, but not consumed by it. Mrs. Igala's voice broke his train of thought. Samira, come and meet Seb. He has just arrived from Egovia. Seb straightened slightly, his curiosity piqued. Seb stood in the grand living room, taking in the elegant surroundings when Mrs. Igala turned to him with a proud smile. Seb, my daughter, Samira. From the staircase, a young woman descended with slow, deliberate steps. She wore a flowery green Ankara top, matching her head tie and wrapper. The fabric hugged her hips, concealing the full length of her legs, yet accentuating her graceful movement. Her face held an air of maturity beyond her years. Dark eyeshadow and liner made her deep-set eyes even more striking. You're welcome, sir, Samira said with a small genuflection. Thank you, Samira. Just Seb would do. He smiled. Mrs. Igala beamed with pride. She's going out shopping with her friends. You remember, I traveled to the UK for her graduation. Her father is trying to fix her with a job in the bank, but she's just too fussy. Even Chief Mboli offered her a job in one of the oil companies in Egovia. Seb nodded thoughtfully. Really good. You should come work in Egovia. It's a cosmopolitan city like Abuja. Plenty of opportunities, modern amenities, and nice people. I'm sure you'd like it. Samira smiled, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. I like it here in the capital city. All my friends are here, and it's been fun. Nice meeting you, Seb. I'll see you later, and we can chat about Manchester. I had a good time there once. She turned toward the door, her wrapper swaying lightly with her movements. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering on the house help, who hurriedly picked up her handbag. It was a look that said it all. What I really want to do now is enjoy myself. All these talks about jobs can wait. Since returning from England, Samira had embraced a new status. She had reconnected with old friends, indulged in the luxuries of home, and basked in the admiration of society. Her return alone had elevated her in the eyes of many, erasing the past. The past, years of missteps and disappointments in England, years that had nearly crushed her mother's spirit, years that carried shame and regret. But now, all of that was behind her. Now her mother could finally show her off with pride. Seb noticed the subtle shift in Mrs. Igala's voice, a tone of satisfaction, of relief. She was undeniably happy to have her daughter back. Seb watched as Samira stepped out of the house. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the sleek car waiting at the entrance. The driver, dressed crisply in a white shirt and black trousers, held the door open. Samira slid into the back seat with effortless ease. The house help followed, placing the shopping bags from a previous outing neatly beside her. Mrs. Igala sighed contentedly. Seb said nothing, but he took in the moment. The daughter had returned, the past had been buried, and for now, all was well in the world of Mrs. Igala. As the car pulled away, he wondered, Was Samira truly free from her past? Or was she simply running from it? Outside, the weather was perfect. Blue skies, a gentle breeze. But inside, behind the closed window and iron burglary proof, the world felt distant, as if it belonged to another reality. Mrs. Igala had gone to great lengths to make Seb feel at home. After showing him to the guest room, she led him to the huge dining table, where a young man promptly served him an ice-cold bottle of beer. Before condensation could form on the glass, a steaming dish of edikang ikong and soft-pounded yam was placed before him. Seb took in his surroundings. The hum of the split-unit air conditioner, the luxurious furniture, the carefully arranged cutlery on the polished mahogany table. There was something almost excessive about it all. He had seen wealth before, but this was on another level. Between bites of the delicious meal, Seb listened attentively as Mrs. Igala got straight to the point. Seb, I have a friend, a business associate. He's very ill. He needs help. Seb paused, wiping his mouth with a napkin. What kind of illness? Heart condition, among other things. Years of chain smoking have caught up with him. There was something urgent in her tone. This wasn't just another wealthy acquaintance. This was someone important to her. 2 hours later, as the evening settled in, Mrs. Igala stood up. Get ready, she said. We're going to see him. Seb had no choice but to follow. As they drove through the well-lit streets of Abuja, Mrs. Igala filled him in. His name is Chief Astor Mandey. He lives in Asokoro, right behind the presidential villa. But that's just one of his homes. He has mansions in Chelsea, Dubai, Paris, and New York. A private jet, a yacht. His business, oil and gas. Seb nodded, listening, though none of this surprised him. They say he gets direct allocations from OPEC. No deal goes through the oil ministry without his involvement. And his family? Seb asked. Several children, scattered across Europe and North America in the most expensive schools. He has 4 wives. I am the 5th, unofficially. Seb raised an eyebrow. His wives call me Ma, she added, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Seb said nothing. The mission was clear. This man was no ordinary patient. Chief Mandey's body was a testament to excess. Years of chain-smoking fine Cuban cigars and indulging in rich processed Western food had taken their toll. The once strong man, whose veins pulsed with power and wealth, now lay in a weakened state, his heart barely capable of sustaining him. His body had been examined, poked, and stented by the best cardiologists money could buy. London, Berlin, New York. He had been to them all, wheeled from private jets straight into the sterile halls of world-class hospitals. But even the best medical teams had delivered their verdict. He could no longer fly, not even in his own jet, which lacked the life support machines and medical staff required to keep him alive mid-air. The international rescue agencies had confirmed it. He was grounded. In London, Chief Mandey had spent over 2 months in a private hospital. His youngest wife, Ife, had been by his side the entire time. She was barely in her 20s, with an unnaturally fair complexion, the kind that made Eskimos look suntanned. She was the daughter of a first-class traditional ruler, a man who had eagerly given his blessing to the marriage. For him, this was not just a union, it was a business arrangement. From the moment his daughter became Mrs. Mandey, the chief's wealth would flow like an endless river into his household. But the celebration was short-lived. Mere weeks after their wedding, the chief suffered his first major heart attack. His Egyptian cardiologist, Dr. Hussein, had been blunt. "Chief, the stents I placed in your arteries are narrowing. The medication will help, but you must change your lifestyle. The smoking, the rich foods, it all has to go. No more Cuban cigars, no more excess." But Chief Mandey was not a man who took orders. Not from politicians, not from businessmen, and certainly not from doctors. They were paid to keep him alive, and that was their job. Lifestyle changes were not up for discussion. Nothing changed. The consequences were inevitable. More heart attacks followed, further weakening the organ that had kept him at the top of the world. In the past, Chief Mandey had believed there was nothing his money couldn't buy. He had private jets, fleets of luxury cars, and properties in cities across the world. But now, he was trapped, unable to board a plane, unable to seek the medical care he had always relied on. For the first time, the limits of his wealth had become clear. Of course, he never complained. He knew what people would say. If you had built world-class hospitals in your own country, you wouldn't be in this mess. And they would be right. But there was still one desperate option left. Mrs. Igala had come up with a plan. "Seb," she said, her voice filled with urgency, "we need to find a world-class cardiologist from Europe, preferably Britain. Someone willing to fly into Abuja and treat him in his mansion. Money is no issue. Just find someone." It was a remarkable act of human desperation.